We're at Vanderbilt's Special Collections Library with Martin Seay, author of The Mirror Thief, and we wanted to ask him a few questions about what one historian has called falling in love with your first book. So thanks for joining us, Martin. I wondered, what was the first book you ever fell in love with?
I guess it's one of those questions that the more you think about it, the more likely your answer is to change. I've been thinking about it, and I guess, as with many things, what you think is love at first turns out not to be later, and this is true for many aspects of our lives. But I remember the things that I read very avidly as a young person. I don't know if anybody reads them anymore, but the Danny Dunn series by J. Williams and Raymond Abrashkin, I believe, Adventures of Scientifically Minded Young People. That I don't know how well they hold up. The science probably has changed a lot. Those were a lot of fun because it was very easy for me to just picture myself in them. But now that I look back and think of things that I most value in the experience of reading, what I keep coming back to is a book that you may or may not remember called Masquerade by a British visual artist named Kit Williams. It came out in 1979. And the premise of the book was it was a 32-page picture story book, a standard picture story book. But Williams had by hand crafted a jeweled hair, as in a rabbit, and buried it somewhere in England, and announced that within the pages of this book, Masquerade, were the clues that would lead the clever youngster or adult to the location of this jeweled rabbit, and you could dig it up and it would be yours. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. So I prevailed. I was probably 7 or 8 years old at the time. I prevailed upon my parents to get me a copy of this thing. It's the strangest book. I mean, to this day, it's the strangest book. That Williams has this almost, it's sort of an old master's style of illustration. He does very elaborate oil paintings that are almost photorealistic, but not quite. They land in the uncanny part of the uncanny valley. And it's a very simple story about the adventures of this particular hare. It's so simple that you know you're not getting the whole thing. And the illustrations are so elaborate. There's so much text and so much detail, weird insects and various things pointing and various other things and visual puns. It's so dense that you're just aware that the ostensible story on the first level is not remotely the full volume of the iceberg that you've got your hands on. And I thought that was cool. And I don't remember, well, at first I thought it was infuriating because I just wanted to find a jeweled rabbit, but and it was obvious that I was not going to solve this thing. But, years later, after the solution to the mystery had been revealed, which was sufficiently complicated, there was no danger of my ever having solved it, it was apparent that didn't exhaust the mysteries contained in the book. That, it should be like a crossword puzzle, right? Like, once you know where the jeweled rabbit is, like, it shouldn't be possible to go back with that book with profit, but it is. At that point, the book is sort of liberated from its ostensible purpose as a guide to a treasure hunt, and just becomes a pure thing that's enormoususly strange. It's got the same sort of mysterious quality as like an old folk song like John Barleycorn, which is clearly allegorical and you can figure it out, but once you know what it's allegorizing, it still doesn't shut it down. It continues to be mysterious. Or even some of the allegories, the old alchemical allegories that would describe the alchemical process in allegorical terms, but they contain mysteries larger than the process itself, which is something that I ended up thinking about a lot while I was writing my book. So, but yeah, that's great. It's a long answer.
But a very interesting one. Is there a book that set you sort of on your current professional path?
Oh, that's a good question. That's I think probably the book that made me want to be a writer was probably All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy, which is one of those influences that you got to be careful with, because once you start to, people tend to start writing like Cormac McCarthy and then can't stop. But it's a book that I'm really glad I read when it came out. Probably would have been '92 or so. I thought it was really good, and it gave me ideas about how a novel can do things that aren't ways that I'd seen or had noticed at least a novel do things before. McCarthy, there's a lot of novels that in addition to telling you a story will try to, to propagate some sort of thesis about the way the world is. Plenty of them do that. I think All the Pretty Horses does that, but it does it, the argument about the way the world is done through the physical descriptions of the landscape, which I thought was pretty slick. That you'll get this description of a cactus or a puddle or something that you think is just a cactus or a puddle, but then the language becomes so freighted and grandiose you realize that it can't possibly be, there's got to be more. It seemed like that was kind of a clever way to make those sort of pronouncements and not actually get called on it. It's a lot of plausible deniability built into that sort of strategy. That's something that I tried to steal in my book.
Is there a book that you share with your friends and family or coworkers?
Oh man, a thing that I think it's books are great to talk about and fantastic to share with in the context of discussion, but I have a hard time actually trying to induce people to read things ever. But as closest as I probably come to that is I do try to get everybody that I meet to read Raymond Chandler. A lot of people have read Raymond Chandler, but I feel like people should really go back to Raymond Chandler. Because as highly rated as he is, I don't think he gets the kind of credit that he really deserves for how smart he is about constructing narratives. I think The Big Sleep is an extraordinarily cleverly constructed novel. It seems like a mess, which is why it's so clever. It's that famous story about the filming of The Big Sleep that Bogart and blanking on who the director was at this point, but it wasn't Hawks. That's it'll come back to me. But arguing about who kills the chauffeur, and like the car winds up in the ocean. They can't figure out who murders the chauffeur, and they call Ray Chandler up in La Jolla and say, "Ray, who kills the chauffeur?" And Ray's like, "I don't know." And, well, you wrote the book. You're looking at the wrong stuff. Was the implication that the entire mystery in The Big Sleep is there in the first 5 or 6 pages, and the rest of the book is a big distraction to get you out of those first 5 pages and eventually back to them. So it's an amazingly well constructed novel. So and probably maybe Huckleberry Finn's pretty good, but it's Catcher in the Rye's pretty good, but I still think it may be the best use of first person narration I can think of, because it solves this kind of tricky technical problem, right? That it's a detective novel, it's a mystery, but historically, if you write a mystery novel in the first person, it's being narrated by Watson, not Holmes, right? So they're not the detective, because you have this technical problem that like the detective figures out the solution to the mystery, but you still have a few pages while you wait for the big reveal. Well, if the detective is narrating, why doesn't she or he just say at that point, "I figured it out, this is the solution, let's go catch the bad person"? And the answer for Chandler is that he's a little nuts. You've got these crazy, can't possibly be true metaphors that run throughout that just tell you right off the bat that this is somebody who I'm just going to have to trust, and he's not always going to be straight with me. So that's why you don't even, by the end of the book, you don't expect him to tell you when he's worked stuff out. You know, he'll tell you when it's good time as far as he's concerned. And you know, it creates one of the great characters in American literature in Philip Marlowe, but it's also a solution to a tricky technical problem. So, and I don't think Ray Shanley gets enough credit for that. So there's that.
Great. Is there a book that you received as a gift that particularly stands out for you?
Notoriously difficult to give books as gifts. And I've been thinking about this, and it's been so long, but I have to conclude, and this winds us up back where we started, the Masquerade. It was something I must have gotten as a gift. I didn't spend my own money on it at age 7. I'm imagining that I had read in some children's publication that my parents were kind enough to subscribe me to, that this weird English guy had done this like rabbit treasure hunt. And you know, if I know my parents whom I love, they probably would have looked at this book and thought that this was a strange thing for a child to be into. It looks like a children's book, but it's not really for children, and yet they deferred to my judgment, such as it was, and got it for me, and probably would have never heard the end of it had they not. Yeah, and I'm certain that book was a gift for me, not going to say that it made me a writer, but I'm not going to not say. I'm not going to say it didn't make me a writer. So, yeah, I read somewhere not too long ago that Kit Williams basically said that what he set out to do, his frustration with children's books and why he didn't necessarily want to illustrate children's books is because they're functional. The illustrations just get you just get you to the end of the story, and then you just set it aside. And he wanted to think of a strategy to get people to really look at his illustrations, because his illustrations are time-consuming and detailed, and he thought people would get a lot more out of them if he slowed them down, and came up with the idea of the treasure hunt to do that, which is pretty good. But you know, it's like I say, although I don't know exactly how he pulls it off, the treasure hunt doesn't exhaust the weirdness of the book. And then, you know, years later, I came across the Russian formalist critic Victor Shklovsky has this concept of defamiliarization. That's very difficult. It's easier to say in Russian, that the idea being basically that, I think, if I remember this correctly, that the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. So the purpose of a work of art is to slow down the process of perception and to make the perceiver aware of both it and the thing being perceived. And when I came across that concept in grad school, I was like, that's cool. Why is this familiar to me? And it occurs to me that the first place I encountered that was probably Masquerade. You know, that you look at these illustrations thinking, I'm going to find the solution to this puzzle, and you look, and you look, and you look, and I don't think you can ever really be done looking at those. So, nice gift.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you so
very
much.